Arden, the time has finally come. At long last, our battle begins.
Your days of what I perceive as villainy are over, Mr. Chimpo. From now on, we shall engage in mortal combat.
To the death, then! Avengers, assemble!
X-Men, get over here and help me, I guess.
Mighty Predator, lend me your strength!
Oh, I don't want the aliens on my team.
Do you bleed? Well, you will.
This is the top 10 versus comics.
Number 10. DC vs. Marvel. First up is an interesting choice in that I figured it was a pretty easy go-to, an easy choice for this top 10. But in doing a bit of research, I found there are some conflicting opinions on the title. I and others are of the opinion this is one of the best Marvel-DC crossovers out there. While I've seen others say that it's not only bad, but it's one of the worst, most disappointing comics ever made. I found that attitude surprising, since these people were being quite reasonable when saying this, and they mentioned other comics that I would agree are also some of the worst comics I've ever read. So it wasn't just people trolling or a difference in taste. I think it comes down to the problem that people have with DC versus Marvel is the reason that I and many other fans seem to love it. It's really nothing but a series of fights between Marvel and DC characters with many of the outcomes determined by fan vote. It has fun writers, good art, and more importantly than anything, is entirely focused on the action. In that regard, DC vs. Marvel delivers as promised. It's a lot of fun and really nails the whole dynamic people would expect out of content like this. There isn't much, if any, depth to any of it, and though it does dig into certain power levels in ways that are somewhat wonky, I had fun with it more than I didn't. I've heard some complaints about one fight between Logan and Lobo occurring off-panel, but by and large, DC vs. Marvel does the job in a lot of ways. A lot of versus comics that you won't be seeing on this top 10 don't. If you call something Batman vs. Captain America, you better really get into the fight. And out of the matches we see in DC vs. Marvel, that's exactly what we get. We even got a sort of apparent winner, as Marvel's characters did win the majority of matches in this story by a score of 6-5. And the whole event did lead to the creation of the Amalgam universe, so it's not like there wasn't anything of value or consequence coming out of these comics either. It's a pretty cool series that, if you ask me, is worth your attention. Number 9. Batman vs. the Incredible Hulk. Now we have a series that is a real classic, and definitely deserves mention as one of the first crossovers between Marvel and DC. This one is a real important story in shaping a lot of crossovers that would follow both within and between Marvel and DC. Featuring the talent of Len Wein, Dick Giordano, and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, this is an interesting comic definitely worth a spot on the top 10. We lost Len Wein this year, and though his contribution to comics is far greater than this small story, it is a good example of the classic fun and imagination he brought to his comics. There's an interesting aspect of this story, too. For example, there's no real focus or explanation for the Hulk's presence in Gotham working at Wayne Enterprises like he is at the start of this story. Later content would explain it was the result of the story taking place on a crossover Earth that contains both Marvel and DC characters in it. Interestingly enough, as I understand how it works legally, that means that this world is co-owned by the two companies. Same with the Amalgam characters I mentioned earlier. Also, though it is called Batman vs. the Hulk, the villains, the Joker, and the Shaper of Worlds are the main threat and the source of conflict in this story. And this is very much an example of the two headlining characters of Batman vs. the Hulk not actually fighting each other in most of the comics. A lot of versus comics do that, and I do normally hold it against it more than I do here. But in these early stages of these sort of crossovers, it's a lot easier to excuse, and no matter how you look at it, Batman and the Hulk do get some interesting encounters with one another, the Joker gets a couple of great moments, and we even have Bruce Wayne working with Bruce Banner, which I thought was kind of a neat detail. It's all quite a bit of fun, and that's the most important thing in this sort of story. And it is worth understanding this comic was very formative in creating crossovers and versus comics in the years to come. So it's an easy choice for one of the best versus comics ever made, even if the occasional cheesy moment keeps it from being any higher on the top 10. Number 8. Avengers vs. X-Men. I remember when this came out, long before Comic Island was ever even really a thing, I was super skeptical about the event. It's fine to have a story about the Avengers battling the X-Men, but if you're gonna do that, I really wanted to dig into a fight between them, have a genuine matchup between these teams, and not derail the story with a unrelated villain showing up the two teams have to work together to beat, or all the other stuff we get in so many other Versus comics. Overall, I was pleasantly surprised by how much Avengers vs. X-Men didn't fall for those pratfalls that so many other Versus comics do. Especially when we include the tie-ins, and this is the sort of event where I think the tie-ins very much are worth reading, we actually get a ton of awesome fights between the Avengers and the X-Men. The best, in my opinion, was a battle between Iron Man and Magneto, which, contrary to what one might expect, was a cool fight that showcased Magneto's incredible power and Tony's ingenuity to get around the massive disadvantage a man encased in metal would face against the Master of Magnetism. That's not the only good fight, though, not by a long shot, and in terms of action, Avengers vs. X-Men consistently delivers great fights in the first half of the story. There's more to it, though. I really like how the story set up the whole conflict. The whole Phoenix thing was kinda silly, but much like how DC's Blackest Night took advantage of the trope of comic book deaths and turned it into a part of the story, Marvel took advantage of the fact that the Avengers and X-Men are published under different wings of their own company, and therefore, outside of crossovers, they tend to stick to their own little worlds. They made that part of their story. So Cyclops and Captain America have this really poignant discussion at the beginning of the event, laying out not only the problems at hand with the approaching Phoenix Force, which is why the Avengers are trying to preemptively deal with this oncoming threat, but also broaching the notion that the X-Men, by and large, at a time when they were most under the threat of extinction and were desperately facing one challenge to their survival after another, were often abandoned and ignored by the Avengers. And that is a devastating moment that really underlies the entire, what feels like a war. It was long enough and sprawled out enough that, yeah, this felt like a genuine war Marvel went through. It leads to a lot of cool character moments as well. For example, in Logan, who with a bunch of other X-Men had already split up from the Summers crew in San Francisco and were struggling to compete with their interests as Avengers versus their identity as mutants. And though it does bend logic a little bit, it did feel like it was a pretty natural conflict in that the Phoenix Force is quite the intimidating threat. There's quite a few of these contrivances throughout the story, but overall this is a great event that definitely deserves recognition as one of the better Versus comics out there. But I would never call it the best. My problem with Avengers vs. X-Men is very much the problems I hear most people have with it. It's all in that second half of the story and the ending in particular. They're quite weak compared to the opening and actual battle between Avengers vs. X-Men. The whole idea is that the Phoenix Force splits up among 5 hosts, and that's kind of interesting, especially as the powers got to them and they started turning on one another. But it derailed the event in a major way and kind of took away the fun of Avengers fighting the X-Men. And thus we kind of descended into many of the Versus tropes that I've been talking about. The heroes have to work together to fight a threat, we get a big comic book death, and everything kind of gets resolved with a wave of a hand. In spite of that, these problems weren't that big of a deal, if you ask me. They are problematic enough that I would never consider Avengers vs. X-Men perfect or above criticism, but it was still a hell of a lot of fun and definitely one of Marvel's events that are actually worth reading, as far as I'm concerned. Number 7. Hawkeye vs. Deadpool. So Marvel's been doing a lot of these specials with Deadpool over the last few years. I've heard fans criticize this, especially the abundance of them, but if you ask me, this is actually the perfect use of Deadpool. The series and the focus on him in the greater Marvel canon does constitute a bit of overuse, but these special miniseries have generally been a lot of fun, and I really like the idea of Deadpool just being in a series of specials with him going up against the entire Marvel universe or against a group of zombies. Many of these specials have included Deadpool versus titles, so he's gone up against many different characters, including the likes of Thanos, Gambit, Carnage, and of course, Hawkeye. If you're a fan of Matt Fraction's Hawkeye run like I am, and enjoyed Jerry Duggan's take on Deadpool, then this is robustly a series for you. It's one of the most artful combinations of two character series put into one story ever made, with all the fun, quirks, and supporting characters of both series being perfectly portrayed in this one. It's a beautifully simple comic, but one that works so well at creating a solid story worth following. It is one of those versus comics where both Hawkeye and Deadpool are teaming up together more than they are ever actually fighting one another, but they have a consistently antagonistic relationship that works quite well to give this story a sense of tension and conflict as they work to solve a greater mystery at hand. I wouldn't think there would be much of a natural dynamic between these two, but thanks to a mistake Hawkeye makes early on in this story, his underlying guilt really make for a compelling take on the two heroes. With that and the open willingness to have fun with the two series, we have something really special. I really enjoy the scene where Hawkeye's dog starts narrating a part of a comic, a rather fun reference to the Hawkeye series, only for Deadpool to openly question what is going on and not understanding anything that's happening. A rather fun reference to Deadpool's character. But the comics are full of great moments like these, in a way that really makes it easily one of the better versus comics I've ever read. The fact that this story starts with Deadpool trick-or-treating with his kid at Hawkeye's apartment building that he looks over, especially a story that sort of lovingly uses these two characters. So it becomes one of the better versus comics I've ever read, and easily the best Deadpool versus comic, though I will point out I have really been enjoying Deadpool vs. Old Man Logan, a new series still currently being published by Marvel with longtime artist Declan Shalvey taking a stab at writing for the company for once. And from what I've seen so far, he has a lot of potential. The series hasn't been good enough thus far to make it onto the top 10, but I did want to give it a shout out for having the best scene I've read in any versus comic, and one of the best openings to a series I have ever read.
Damn it, Wilson! I told you... Told you not... You not to... Damn it, Wade! I told you not to double dare them!
Number 6. Archie vs. Predator. This is a miniseries that perhaps is one of the best examples of having fun with a crossover. And I kid you not, this is one of my favorite comics to ever come out of the Archie line, and easily one of the best versus comics ever made. The pairing is silly, everyone knows that, and everyone embraces it. Writer Alex DeCampi and the art team went out of their way to make this comic every bit as fun and as goofy an idea as something like this should be. It's so good, so silly, and just so perfect. I cannot understate how much I enjoyed DeCampi's writing here. She really nailed the tone this story needed to hit quite perfectly. Appropriately, the story involves the Predator hunting down Archie Andrews and his friends. It's full of gore and violence, which is really fun to see in an Archie comic, and pairs well against the innocent nature of those original Archie stories. The artists went out of their way to make this series look like an average Archie comic book, even using traditional non-digital art techniques and shipping their prints to each other instead of relying on digital scans or copies. That effort really shows and is what kind of pushes Archie vs. Predator into this top-tier quality comic. The dark sense of humor is right up my alley, and the twist ending to this thing, I can't give it away, but let's just say it's the only comic on here that made me laugh as much as that opening scene in Deadpool vs. Old Man Logan. If you haven't read Archie vs. Predator and the idea of it kind of sounds funny to you, like you might be amused by it, I definitely recommend you check these comics out, because it will definitely be worth your time. Number 5. Nick Fury vs. S.H.I.E.L.D. So here's a versus comic quite straightforward in its design. Nick Fury unravels a conspiracy that ultimately pits him against the entire collected force of S.H.I.E.L.D. itself, and a series of globe-trotting espionage antics ensue. Out of all the comics on this top 10, this one is least like a crossover and mostly like a story existing within a character's own canon. Since Nick Fury is already engrossed in the world of S.H.I.E.L.D. to begin with, it's really just a switch on him actually working against his own agency, pretty much. So this is a story about Nick Fury dealing with his world turning against him. and everything that his life is typically surrounded with, including the agency's vast resources and numbers, life model decoys, and all sorts of other surprises and cool tech along the way. Much like Archie vs. Predator, Nick Fury vs. S.H.I.E.L.D. never really tries to be anything other than what it is. And what it is a sort of pumped up version of any James Bond story ever made. In that regard, this story is pretty much perfect. For what it does, for what it tries to be, it's a great comic that's a lot of fun overall. The espionage stuff is super enjoyable to follow, the art is very cool and over the top, and it's a fun, polished story with lots of interesting dialogue packed into it. It reminds me a lot of Wolverine, Enemy of the State, or the movie Captain America, the Winter Soldier. But Nick Fury vs. S.H.I.E.L.D. did it first, and they did it very well. Number 4. Aliens vs. Predator. We would be remiss not to include the Alien vs. Predator comic line somewhere in this top 10. Dark Horse has had a long history of doing cool stories with these two alien species, and I considered a lot of their comics from those franchises for this video. There are quite a few of these Dark Horse comics that I was considering for this, including Superman vs. Aliens 2, which very nearly earned a spot on this top 10. But in the end, it only wound up including Archie vs. Predator and this comic, the one that pretty much started the entire Alien vs. Predator franchise. These comics were a very simple story of a colony being attacked by predators who are hunting an alien down on the planet. You can pretty much be able to put together the basics beyond that. Following up on earlier Dark Horse content, a bunch of humans die before they discover the aliens, a corporation knew about the aliens and secretly wanted to study them, even more people end up dying, a queen shows up, and a sole human survivor ultimately earns the respect of a predator who marks her with the symbol of his clan. Years later, the human is greeted by predators who recognize the mark and invite her on a hunt. If some of that sounds familiar, it should, because it's the genesis for pretty much the entire Alien vs. Predator franchise, but especially that first movie. You can see how it inspired a lot of that film, but overall this comic is, in my opinion, even more fun and a more balanced take on the franchise. It has a decent amount of heart to it, it's very well drawn, and has a firm role in creating an entire franchise out of two other franchises, which is pretty cool. It's quite the comic, and in my eyes is a great example of how powerful a good versus title can really be. Speaking of which... Number 3. Superman vs. the Amazing Spider-Man. Nearing the peak of our top 10 is the groundbreaking 1976 issue, Superman vs. Spider-Man. The first ever superhero company crossover, and the second time two major publishers collaborated on a comic ever. Superman vs. Spider-Man is a true classic and easily one of my favorite versus comics ever made. Written by legendary Spider-Man writer Jerry Conway, and with various artists from both companies, including Neil Adams and John Romita Sr., drawing their own characters in the same panel, thanks to Neil Adams kinda quietly redrawing Superman in some of the early prints of this comic. This is nothing but a labor of love, and is one of my favorites easily. It's much like Batman vs. the Hulk, full of contrivances to even out the vastly different power levels of these two heroes, though this comic was a vastly superior iteration of what was basically the same idea. Not only did this comic come first, setting the groundwork for pretty much every crossover to ever follow, even within Marvel and DC's own line of characters, I also found Superman vs. Spider-Man to be a lot of fun. Yes, like Batman vs. the Hulk, Spider-Man and Superman only briefly fight before spending more time dealing with Dr. Octopus and Lex Luthor working together than they do worrying about each other. Still, it's a lot of fun. It's a historically important comic book, and in spite of the shift to the villains pretty early on, what fighting we do get between Superman and Spider-Man is pretty awesome. It's also a neat pairing. The relative optimism and symbolic nature of these two characters makes them a good team, and it's just cool to see them interact, because we never really do. Spider-Man is often compared to Batman because they have similar levels of strength and motivations, especially when compared to Superman, but having these two work together as two of the biggest superheroes ever, even if they have to give Spider-Man a bit of a boost to accomplish that, is a lot of fun, and a great chapter in Silver Age comic book history. The added touch of having Superman being drawn more in the DC style while Spider-Man is more preserved in the Spider-Man style really makes it a cool comic book to me. It reflects how this comic hails from one of the greatest periods in both Marvel and DC history, and it was interesting reading about how Stan Lee and Carmine Infantino, then the creative heads of these two companies, were able to make it happen. So yeah, there may have been better crossovers in terms of raw quality and versus stories told since, but this is the one that told it first, and it was done with legendary figures behind the scenes. It is, without a doubt in my mind, one of the best versus comics in the history of this industry. Number 2. Zombies vs. Robots. So here's the comic that I straight up was gonna give to first place. Zombies vs. Robots is the only entry here from IDW, but very much deserves a spot on the list. As a great example of some of the phenomenal work that comes out of the company these days, it is the initial Zombies vs. Robots comics, but the franchise in general, that I would define as some of the best versus content out there in the Western world. I really like this one, and its phenomenal art sells a comic that takes itself seriously enough that the premise really works. Featuring a dystopian world where zombies have taken over and robots struggle to save what little remains of the human race, Zombies vs. Robots is an excellent piece. Chris Feld does some top-notch, non-traditional, non-linear storytelling, but it's always Ashley Wood's art that everyone talks about for this series, and for good reason. Thanks to her art, she creates a vivid story of robots trying to protect an innocent little baby from a destroyed and hostile world. And because of it, it reads like a real experience, where you get pulled into the story so thoroughly it feels less like you're reading it, and just sort of following along as an adventure unfolds around you. The biggest problem is all these cool ideas and this great setting just feels too short. I wish we would get more of this stuff. And luckily we do get follow-up series and that sort of thing, but it goes by faster than I'd like. But that's a problem that you want to have. You want your story to leave the reader wanting more. So Zombies vs. Robots is an easy choice to recommend and recognize as one of the best in the world of versus comics. Though it was originally slated to win, since I couldn't at first think of any comic better than it, I did stumble across one I was quickly convinced actually is better, and ultimately deserved to win. So let's get to that. Number 1. Spider-Man vs. Wolverine. Logan and Peter have always had an interesting relationship, and that tracks back quite a ways, before even this single giant-sized special issue came out. Just the same, Spider-Man vs. Wolverine is such a cool encounter between these two characters. On balance, it's kind of a perfect versus comic. The best part is it really tells a polished story that very much feels appropriately titled, too. So while it does a great deal of politics surrounding the Cold War, and there is a ton of character work in Spider-Man and Wolverine working together, it's very much about them fighting and their differences with each other. The character dynamics behind these two is thoroughly explored here in a way I don't think I've ever seen since. As a result, this comic sticks with me in a profound way few other versus comics ever do. The whole point of this story is that Spider-Man and Logan get caught up in an adventure on the other side of the Berlin Wall. The two get into a fight when Spider-Man tries to stop Logan from killing a spy who wants to die to avoid Soviet torture. And that fact is one of the biggest assets of the comic. Rather than most of these versus stories, which kind of start with them fighting and then get into the real story, the story builds up towards these two characters fighting each other, instead of pretty much any other versus comic out there. That's awesome, and it works very well for making this story fit with the title of the comic. They don't shy away from the differing powers of the two either. Logan points out how Spider-Man could, with great difficulty, kill him. But Logan could kill Spider-Man with a single use of his claws, and is pretty much holding back for the entire fight. Then the spy, knowing Spider-Man is tense and all freaked out, sneaks up behind Peter and deliberately provokes him into hitting her thinking she was Logan. And he put enough force into that blow that it actually kills her. So a devastated Peter is forced to live with this, and he and Logan just, without saying a word, kind of just go home. And Peter's just left to think about it, just replay it over and over again in his head. He wasn't really at fault, he didn't, willingly do this, but he did kill somebody. It's a hell of an ending, a big and often overlooked moment in Spider-Man history. And it's handled so well and executed so brilliantly, I just can't get that ending out of my head. Spider-Man is clearly haunted by the moment, but it's also a big wake-up call that he needs to be careful and responsible about his powers. An important reminder of just how strong and dangerous he could really be. It's unsettling, but I think it really could have only happened in a story with Logan like this. But unfortunately, overall, it hasn't really been dealt with in following comics. I think it kind of got lost in the mix because it was a really interesting character development, and I wish they'd kind of followed up on this a bit more. Still, Spider-Man vs. Wolverine is a wonderful, intelligent mix of politics, character work, superpowers, and a mistake that had a real impact on Spider-Man at the end of the story. Like I said, the only thing that could have made it better is if it actually was followed up on in subsequent Spider-Man comics, but that's not this comic's fault, and I don't hold it against it that they didn't really go in that direction. It might have just been a little too edgy and difficult for Spider-Man to deal with at the time. It's a shame because the story does so much right and leaves me with chills after reading it. That's no easy feat. But it deserves that accolade. It deserves it in spades. It's not good for a superhero comic. It's just a wonderful standalone story featuring two well-defined characters. Regardless how you feel about Marvel in general, without caveat, exaggeration, or apology, Spider-Man vs. Wolverine is my all-time favorite versus comic.
So that's the end. This was a winner of our weekly poll. Each week our patrons get to vote on a video that we make. If you would like to do so yourself, you can check out how to do so in the video description down below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and keep reading comics.